Nishida Kitaro was the founder of the Kyoto school and the first major modern Japanese philosopher to create an original philosophical system. The Kyoto school emerged in Kyoto, where its thinkers stood at the crossroads of East Asian spiritual traditions and modern Western philosophy. Nishida's writings often refer more explicitly to Western thinkers than to Asian ones, especially Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and the other neo-Kantians, yet his philosophy is also deeply shaped by Zen, Mahayana Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and other Indian thought. The clearest example of this is Nishida's idea of absolute nothingness. This does not mean mere non-existence or a blank void. It means the most inclusive place or field in which all beings arise, relate, and become what they are. Nishida translates these ideas into the language of modern philosophy, often using a dialectical style that recalls Hegel. Like Hegel, he does not treat the absolute as a static object, but as the living movement through which reality becomes intelligible. At the same time, Nishida preserves a crucial distinction between the finite self and the absolute. Through his idea of inverse correspondence, he argues that the self depends entirely on the absolute, yet never simply becomes identical with it. In An Inquiry into the Good, Nishida challenges a basic assumption of modern epistemology, that experience begins with an already formed subject who then comes to know an external world. For Nishida, the most original level of experience comes before the split between subject and object. It is the immediate act of seeing, hearing, judging, or willing before we step back and say, I am the one having this experience. He calls this pure experience. Nishida argues that pure experience is the most basic reality, from which both the individual self and the world of distinct objects emerge. Thinking, judging, and willing are not separate from pure experience, but are more developed forms of it. Moral life, which Nishida connects with the good, is thus the realization of a deeper unity at the source of experience. Nishida asks what kind of structure reality must have if knowledge is possible, and to answer this, he develops what he calls the logic of place, or basho. Traditional logic treats reality as made up of individual subjects that possess properties. For example, the horse is running. The horse is the subject, and running is attached to it as a predicate. Nishida argues that this logic is derivative. Subject and predicate can be related only because they already appear within a wider place or field. In works such as From the Acting to the Seeing, he therefore shifts from a metaphysics of isolated substances to a logic of the field in which things appear and relate. Consciousness should be understood as a field in which things become manifest. Its most basic feature is self-awareness. Consciousness reflects itself within itself as part of its very structure. Individual self-awareness is therefore a limited expression of a more basic, self-reflective field that includes both self and world. Nishida describes reality as a series of increasingly inclusive fields or places, from nature to consciousness to self-awareness, and finally to the deepest field of absolute nothingness. Absolute nothingness names the deepest basho, or place, within which all of reality appears. It is not a separate substance, mind, or creator standing apart from the world, but the ultimate condition that allows determinate things to arise at all. In East Asian thought, nothingness does not simply mean non-existence. The Japanese term mu, like the Buddhist idea of sunyata, or emptiness, points beyond the opposition between being and non-being. In Mahayana Buddhism, emptiness means that things have no fixed, independent essence. They arise through relation and interdependence. They are not unreal, but exist dynamically. As the Heart Sutra says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is the openness through which beings appear as what they are. Hence, Nishida's absolute nothingness is not nihilism, It is absolute because it is not confined to any particular form and can therefore allow all forms to appear without becoming one thing among them. Nishida describes this process as a kind of self-determination without a separate determiner. Reality unfolds actively, but not through the action of an external agent. Absolute nothingness is the groundless field in which the world arises and in which finite beings become self-aware. The theory of Basho thus describes a living process of world formation. Reality is dynamic, it develops through relations, actions, and changing historical contexts. In his later work, Nishida gives increasing importance to human action and history, describing the world as a dialectical universal, a shared field in which individuals encounter and recognize one another, act upon their experience, and mutually shape reality. This, of course, is reminiscent of Hegel. History is thus the way the world continually forms itself through human interaction. Nishida describes this as a movement from the created to the creating. What has already come into being becomes the basis for new creation without ever fully determining what comes next. Each moment gathers the past into itself while opening towards the future. Nishida refers to this as the absolute present, or the eternal now. History is a continuity of discontinuities, a unity that includes real breaks, differences, and new beginnings. Human beings do not act as disembodied minds. We act through what Nishida calls the expressive or historical body. The body is not merely a physical object in nature, it is the way we express ourselves, meet others, and participate in the historical world, which is the most concrete level of reality. Nature and life thus become fully concrete only within their historical existence. Nishida describes this whole process as the self-identity of contradictories, a unity that holds real differences together without reducing them to simple sameness. This also shapes his view of the self. Selfhood is formed through relation. I become myself by encountering you as truly other than me, and you become yourself in the same way. However, Nishida also argues that the self only becomes truly itself through contact with an absolute other at its own depths. This is the experience that breaks the illusion of a permanent self-contained ego. Self-awareness is therefore also self-awakening. The true self appears through the negation of the false, isolated self. Nishida applies the same logic to the relation between the one and the many. The world is one, yet it exists only through many individuals. Individuals are many, yet each is formed within the one world. The world is not a container that exists first and merely holds things inside it. It is the shared field in which individuals shape one another, and through which the world comes to realization. In this way, Nishida preserves real difference while showing that self and world arise within a deeper unity. Again, this is all essentially Hegel's doctrine of the concrete universal. Finally, towards the end of his life, Nishida connected the meaning of the self more directly with death, religious awareness, and the relation between the finite person and the absolute, which he sometimes calls God. This is especially clear in his late work, The Logic of Place and the Religious Worldview. For Nishida, death is not simply a future event at the end of life, it is present throughout life as the mark of human finitude. Each person is fragile, limited, and not self-sufficient. Death therefore reveals the self most clearly. I become fully aware of myself not by clinging to a fixed identity, but by recognizing my mortality. What makes me an individual is not a permanent inner essence, but the very finitude that limits me and sets me apart. This confrontation with death opens the self toward the absolute. Nishida's God is not a separate creator standing outside the world, nor is God simply identical with the world in a pantheistic sense. God names the all-embracing reality within which finite life exists. Nishida identifies this true absolute with absolute nothingness, the ultimate field that contains even its own self-negation. The absolute is absolute because it can express itself within the finite world without becoming finite itself. Nishida describes this relation by saying that God is immanently transcendent. The absolute transcends the finite self while being present through self-negation and by allowing finite beings to exist in their own distinctness. Reality is affirmed not by avoiding negation, but by passing through it. The finite self depends completely on the absolute, yet is not simply dissolved into it. This leads to Nishida's idea of inverse correspondence. The finite self and the absolute are inseparable, yet never simply identical. The closer the self comes to the absolute, the more clearly its own finitude and distinctness are revealed. The self becomes truly itself not by asserting independence, but by passing through self-negation and awakening to its dependence on the absolute. This has obvious parallels with Christian mysticism, especially Meister Eckhart, who spoke of a breakthrough beyond ordinary images of both self and world into a deeper nothingness. Nishida echoes this when he says that, in true awareness of absolute nothingness, there is neither I nor God. This does not mean that the world or the person disappears, rather the self is restored through self-emptying. Unity with the absolute does not erase difference, it makes true individuality possible. In 1930, Tanabe Hajime, Nishida's former student and later colleague, publicly challenged Nishida in an essay often translated as requesting instruction from Professor Nishida. This was the start of the Kyoto school movement. Tanabe criticized Nishida's idea of the place of absolute nothingness. He worried that if absolute nothingness is described as an all-encompassing place, it can start to sound like a hidden metaphysical ground. In that case, Nishida's attempt to overcome substance metaphysics might still leave something behind, like a final foundation. Tanabe wanted to push further. Again, like Hegel, Tanabe saw that philosophy does not advance by building a final system, it advances by passing through failure. Human reason tries to ground itself, but eventually discovers its own limits. This collapse becomes the opening for transformation. The finite self must undergo a kind of death and rebirth, giving up the illusion of self-sufficiency. Tanabe describes this through the Shin Buddhist idea of other power, or tariki, which refers to the power of transformation that becomes active when the self realizes that it cannot save, ground, or complete itself by its own power. Philosophy thus becomes Meta-noetics, a path of repentance, self-critique, and self-overturning. Nishida responded to Tanabe by insisting that his absolute nothingness was never a transcendent one beyond the world. It is precisely the self-negating activity through which beings become what they are. After Tanabe, Nishitani Kaiji turned the Kyoto school's concern with nothingness into a response to the modern problem of nihilism. In works such as Religion and Nothingness, he begins with the concrete crisis of modern life, the collapse of meaning, the loss of religious certainty, and the feeling that both self and world have become groundless. For Nishitani, when the ego treats itself and the world as fixed, independent things, the self becomes enclosed in itself, and other beings are reduced to objects. When this ego-centered world collapses, one may fall into a destructive nihilism, where everything appears meaningless and nothing seems to have real value. Nishitani argues that this crisis cannot be solved by simply returning to old beliefs, it must be faced and passed through. One must pass through nihility in order to awaken to emptiness, which is the open field in which things are no longer clung to as fixed substances, where beings are allowed to appear in their impermanence, interdependence, and suchness. Ueda Shizutaru, a student of Nishanti, was both a Zen practitioner and a major scholar of Meister Eckhart, and his work explores the boundary between philosophy and religious awakening. A central concern of the later Kyoto school generally was the meaning of the self after the critique of the modern ego. Ueda and Nishitani thus did not simply reject selfhood in favour of Buddhist non-self, but rather argue that the self becomes truly itself only by passing through self-negation, which is the overcoming of ego-centred attachment. Nishitani described the true self as a self that is not a self, which will not be an unfamiliar sentiment for followers of this channel. And Ueda, building on Fichte, presents the formula, I, not being I, am I. The self is not a fixed substance that simply asserts, I am I. It becomes itself by opening beyond itself. Ueda calls this opening the ecstatic space, a space in which genuine encounter with otherness becomes possible. These ideas are explained by the Japanese term soku-hi, which means is and is not. This refers to the idea of the mutual determination of universality and particularity in nature, and the emphasis on non-attachment to linguistic predicates and subjects as representations of the real. Affirmation is reached through negation, and the self becomes itself by standing on the field of emptiness, freed from attachment to its own fixed identity. Going back to Nishida, the individual self is a point of self-determination within the wider field of absolute nothingness. The self becomes truly individual only by negating the illusion of self-sufficiency. Nishitani and Ueda give this structure a more existential and religious emphasis. Modern Western philosophy often leaves the subject trapped in ego consciousness. The self stands over against the world, turns beings into objects, and tries to secure itself through knowledge, will, or moral autonomy. Nishitani and Ueda thus turn to figures such as Meister Eckhart and Nietzsche. Eckhart speaks of a breakthrough beyond the ordinary self and even beyond ordinary images of God. Nietzsche exposes the collapse of inherited values and forces the modern self to confront nihilism directly. Nishitani interprets both through Zen. The deepest standpoint is not egoic subjectivity, but non-ego, or subjective nothingness. This subjective nothingness is not an empty inner space. Like the Zen koan of Mu, it breaks down the dualism between self and world. Nishitani calls this the moment when the bottom drops out. The ego loses its ground and returns to the groundless openness of existence. At this point, the self possesses not a single thing. But this poverty is also freedom. Because the self no longer clings to itself, it can encounter beings without obstruction. Here we can also see the difference between relative nothingness and absolute nothingness. Relative nothingness is merely the negation of being, or non-being, or the privation of being. It can also mean a consciousness treated as the empty field in which objects appear. But Nishida's absolute nothingness is deeper than both. It is the ultimate place in which being and non-being, self and world, finite and infinite, arise and are overcome. Nishitani sees Meister Eckhart as coming remarkably close to absolute nothingness with his notion of the Godhead, even though this lies far from orthodox Christian faith, which limits the concept of nothingness to the relative nothingness, which is the absolute privation of being from which the cataphatic God creates the world. Ueda similarly finds great affinity with Eckhart, though ultimately finds negative theology in general to still imply an inexpressibly higher being hidden behind the world. Nishitani and Ueda, conversely, are pointing to a nothingness so absolute and non-dual that it is, paradoxically, found only in the concrete facts of conventional experience. In conclusion, the common thread running through the Kyoto school is that absolute nothingness is not merely an abstract metaphysical idea, but a field of transformation. The self becomes truly itself only by ceasing to cling to itself as a fixed ego. The central insight of the Kyoto school, therefore, is that freedom arises through self-emptying, a theme that will become especially important when we turn, in the next video, to Masao Abe's attempt to unite Christianity and Buddhism.